The August heat pressed down on the railway siding outside Auschwitz as a line of cattle cars sat motionless in the haze. The air smelled of coal dust, sweat, and the sour odor that clung to every transport arriving from the occupied Netherlands. When the doors finally slid open, the light hit the faces of hundreds of men, women, and children who had been trapped inside for days. Among them was a slight, dark-haired woman in a simple gray dress, her posture straight despite exhaustion. She carried nothing but a rosary tucked into her sleeve. Her name, entered on the transport manifest as Edith Stein, had been crossed out and replaced with the number assigned to her upon arrival. She stepped down onto the dirt with the quiet composure of someone who understood exactly where she had been taken. Her journey to that siding began long before the war. Edith had been born in Breslau in 1891 to a devout Jewish family. She had been a bright, determined child who taught herself to read years ahead of schedule and showed an early intensity in her studies that surprised even her teachers. When she entered university, she pursued philosophy with a seriousness few could match, eventually becoming a student and assistant to Edmund Husserl, one of Europe's leading thinkers. Her work earned respect, but because she was a woman and a Jew, academic posts remained closed to her. She tried not to dwell on the limitations imposed by prejudice, burying herself instead in writing and teaching. After years of wrestling with questions of identity and belief, Edith found herself drawn to Christianity. She converted to Catholicism in 1922, a decision that cut her off from parts of her own family, but opened a new path she embraced with complete conviction. She eventually joined the Carmelite order, taking the name Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. Life inside the convent gave her a quiet refuge where she continued to write, pray, and teach, though she never forgot the world outside its walls. As the Nazi movement tightened its grip on Germany, she understood the danger growing around her. Jewish converts were not spared from the widening sphere of racial laws. Her presence in the convent risked drawing unwanted attention to the sisters who sheltered her. By 1938, the situation had become too dangerous to ignore. The Carmelites arranged for her transfer to a convent in the Netherlands, hoping Dutch neutrality would protect her. Edith accepted the move without complaint, leaving behind the small comforts she had built over years in Cologne. At the new convent in Echt, she resumed her quiet routine, but she could not escape the news filtering in from occupied Europe. Germany invaded the Netherlands in 1940, and the occupation brought the same harsh restrictions that had already reshaped life in her homeland. Jewish people, whether practicing or not, were stripped of rights, employment, and freedom. Edith understood that her name alone placed her in danger. The Dutch bishops openly condemned Nazi racial policies in 1942, delivering a pastoral letter that infuriated the German authorities. In retaliation, the Nazis ordered the arrest of all Jewish converts to Catholicism. The sweep was efficient. On August 2nd, German officers arrived at the convent in Echt. A sister answered the door and found men in uniform demanding Edith by name. Edith, hearing the commotion, appeared in the hallway with her sister Rosa, who had also sought refuge there. The officers read the order without expression. Edith calmly gathered a few belongings, but a guard told her she would not need them. Before being led away, she turned to Rosa and said softly, "Come, let us go for our people," a sentence remembered by the sisters who stood watching in helpless silence. Edith and Rosa, along with dozens of other arrested Catholics of Jewish descent, were transported first to Amersfoort and then to the Westerbork transit camp. Conditions there were harsh and disorienting, but those who witnessed Edith during those days later described her as remarkably composed. She worked to comfort frightened children, shared her limited rations, and offered words of reassurance to people who had lost their families. She had no illusions about where deportation trains from Westerbork were headed. The camp was a funnel, and everyone inside understood the direction the tracks ran. On August 7th, Edith and Rosa were loaded into a train bound for Auschwitz. The transport was packed so tightly that passengers could barely sit. There was almost no water, no sanitation, and the August heat turned the cattle cars into stifling chambers. During the long journey, witnesses recalled Edith moving among those near her, whispering prayers or helping elderly passengers stay upright as the train lurched on. She could not change their fate, but she tried to make the hours bearable. When the train reached Auschwitz on August 9th, the new arrivals were pulled from the cars and sorted in hurried lines. Officers shouted orders and dogs barked as families clung to each other. Edith stood beside Rosa when the selection began. The prisoners were divided into those deemed fit for labor and those who were not. Women with children, the elderly, the sick, and anyone showing signs of weakness were immediately directed toward the trucks waiting to take them deeper into the camp complex. Edith and Rosa were placed in that group. They walked together toward the vehicles, surrounded by guards who hurried them along. Transport records and post-war testimonies indicate that the women of that transport were taken directly to the gas chambers at Birkenau. There were no work assignments, no registration numbers tattooed on their arms, no barracks. They were brought into a structure disguised as a bathhouse, told to undress, and pushed into a chamber crowded with other prisoners. The heavy doors closed, and within minutes, canisters of Zyklon B were emptied into the vents. The gas reacted with air, releasing a deadly vapor that filled the room. There were no survivors. The bodies were removed, searched, and taken to the crematoria. Any possessions collected upon arrival were sorted in warehouses. Edith Stein, who had spent her life pursuing truth through scholarship and faith, disappeared into a system designed to erase individuals completely. For months after the transport, the convent in Echt held hope that she and Rosa might somehow have survived. Only after the liberation of the camps did the full scope of the murder process become clear. In the years that followed the war, survivors of Westerbork and members of the Carmelite order preserved Edith's memory with quiet determination. Her philosophical writings resurfaced, her conversion and later work gained recognition, and her death became a symbol of the countless lives extinguished, not for deeds or beliefs, but for ancestry alone. Her story traveled far beyond the walls of the convents where she had once sought peace. Today, memorials across Europe bear her name. They do not restore what was taken from her, nor do they erase the brutality of her final days, but they ensure that her life is remembered not simply as one more victim of the Holocaust, but as a woman who confronted her fate with clarity and compassion. While surrounded by cruelty, she could not stop. Those who study her work see both a philosopher and a witness to a darkness that reshaped the world. Edith Stein's execution at Auschwitz remains intertwined with the history of the millions murdered there. Yet her story stands out because we know enough of her life to understand not just the way she died, but the courage with which she faced the world that killed her. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.